Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Amber, and on behalf of a suitable agency and Sunder Nursery, I'd like to welcome you all to the inaugural session of what we like to call Season 2 of Suitable Conversations at Sunder Nursery. At a suitable agency, our love for all things books is what inspired the idea for this series. And we are extremely grateful to everyone at Sunder Nursery, and in particular Ratish Nanda, who's here with us, for their enthusiastic support and encouragement in making this happen. There would be no suitable conversations without them. And now for the event we've all been waiting for. Abhijit Banerjee will be in conversation with Shrayana Bhattacharya on good economics, poor economics. Abhijit Banerjee, just a few words about the speakers. Abhijit Banerjee won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2019. He is the author of 2 books written with Esther Duflo, Poor Economics and Good Economics for Hard Times. Shrayana Bhattacharya is an economist and writer. She trained in development economics at Delhi University and Harvard University. Since 2014, in her role as an economist with the World Bank, she has focused on issues related to social policy and jobs. Prior to this, she worked on research projects for women and labor with the Center for Policy Research, the SEWA Union, and the Institute of Social Studies Trust. Her first book, Desperately Seeking Shahrukh, India's Lonely Young Women and the Search for Intimacy and Independence, was published to wide acclaim in 2021, after which it went on to become a bestseller. And as of this week, it is now out in paperback. And now I promise, without further ado, please let's give our speakers a round of applause and start.
Well, thanks, everyone. Firstly, I want to really thank everybody who RSVP'd and also put in questions for Abhijit. I think we had that in the RSVP chat. And that was very helpful for me because you'll see I'll try as much as possible to include and reflect some of the questions that were sent forward. What I thought I would do, just to keep it a bit interesting, is to perhaps read a little bit. First, how many people here are students of economics right now? That's a significant. So I think this will perhaps resonate. Abhijit wrote for the Nobel Prize Committee a short autobiographical essay about when he was trying to figure out which field he would study. And I want to read just a few snippets of that because I think it'll resonate with many of the students here. So he starts with, I guess I will never know why Harvard admitted me. My application was handwritten in my rather scratchy hand, and the research proposal was borderline nonsensical. He goes on, once he reaches Harvard, which I didn't realize, but you were almost not going to go because the visa was a big question because you were in jail briefly for a protest. He did go to Harvard. And when he showed up, he was trying to figure out which field to declare. And this is what he has to say. Econometrics was boring and similar to what I had studied in JNU. And so I skipped most of it. Development economics was in the throes of computational general equilibrium models that seemed to be of the view that we already knew everything about the way the world worked, and all we lacked was the computational capacity to figure out what happens in specific cases. And last, and this is where I want to pick up to just start our conversation, he says about macroeconomics, macro was deeply confusing. The application of rational expectations to various dynamic models generated a certain kind of black magic that I learned painfully to reproduce, but found entirely implausible. Abhijit, I want to ask you about where economics is right now in terms of models, the practical management of economies, given we are now in a time of conflict, there's COVID, there's climate change. There are all these, what we like to call exogenous shocks, but the fat tail of uncertainty is just growing fatter. I want to ask you one, what does that imply in the way we theorize and think about intervening in the economy? The IMF recently put out its global outlook and it said policymakers should have a steady hand. And there's, I almost find it's almost like trying to sort of keep calm and carry on through catastrophe, because essentially what they're saying is there might be some miscalibration between monetary policy, fiscal policy, And there might be bad effects, but let's not talk about that. But there's a scale, huge scale of a cost of living crisis being played out across the globe. Who's getting it right? Who's possibly getting it wrong in terms of the experience of countries or suggestions that policymakers are implementing? And I do want to start before we go into development economics, maybe to ask you a little bit about where macro and thinking about economic management stands, given we are facing all these multiple crises and catastrophes.
Remember, the point of that story was that I avoided macro. What I'm going to say is should come with the usual, or actually specific warning to the buyers. I think it's unlikely to be reliable, but I might as well tell you what's. So I feel that right now we have two worlds. One is a very sophisticated world of people who kind of I think macro is coming to grips with the fact that the world is maybe too complicated or for the particular structures it imposes on it. And it's coming to grips with that. I think, on the other hand, policymakers are always trained 20 years before. And so they live in that other world where there was an assurance that if you do this, that will happen. And that's the confidence that, we can bring inflation into control. I think they're finding right now that they're not succeeding, and the U.S. is, we're at 4.5% or 4%, and at 4%, you would think that things would start to slow down, but in fact, October jobs were up by 250,000. So something's happening there that we don't understand. And I think assuming that what we understood before, therefore, and since we have no way to update our expectations, we might as well just stick to that, might be dangerous. That's the worry. And I think they understand that that's the worry. I don't think at least the IMF is not naive about it. I think it understands that right now, but I don't think there's much guidance. I think it's sort of like what happens if the inflation doesn't come down. And there's no, I mean, are we willing to go to, what Reagan did in 1980? That sent the whole world into recession, created the debt crisis in Latin America, is to send interest rates in some countries to 20%, real rates, 20% real. Now, 20% real means no businesses can operate. So, we can get there. We can surely stop inflation once we have everybody out of a job. Now, whether that's the way to go, or, I mean, in many ways, I feel that it's partly, I mean, inflation is costly. It's also the case that people seem to think that inflation and their own jobs are entirely separated domains. So people, of course, in real terms, since the beginning of the year, in the US at least, real wages have been falling. So meaning inflation is faster than wage growth, but a little bit. They've been falling a little bit. On the other hand, if you really do what the US Fed is bent on doing, a lot of people will lose their jobs. And when they lose their jobs, that would not be a little bit. They're going to lose a lot. And somehow they seem to be so hell-bent on, and the Biden administration is going to lose the midterm polls. That's in a couple of days, or largely because of this inflation. So people, I think, are extraordinarily, and that's true in India as well. There is a certain view of inflation which is unhinged from their, personal outcomes. So my wage has gone up. That's because I'm smarter. The inflation is because things are bad. That particular dualism allows people to constantly be against inflation. So, of course, it's always better if your wage goes up and prices don't go up. But that's not always on offer. So I think they're very willing to, I think, kill, or actually, they think the goose won't be killed Therefore, they think if we could just stop the inflation, I can be richer and richer, not quite noticing the connection between the two. And I think that's at the core of what the Fed is up against and the Indian government is up against. It's this mindset of and we actually maybe have little bit deepened that problem. And we were used to 10% inflation. And we were doing pretty well at 10% inflation because basically that means that the government debt, the interest on the government debt effectively is negative something. And therefore, we had a period where the government was borrowing like mad. And the government debt share in GDP was falling all the time because inflation was so high. Maybe that's the one form of relative flexibility we are left. So I don't know that we are fully on top of this idea of what inflation means for us either. But it's a real problem because it's sort of, in some sense, it's this very simple thing. I don't think that inflation has anything to do with the fact that my wages have been going up, and that till we can somehow break that that duality, I think we are always in trouble.
Can I pick up, in fact, on that idea of duality? And I want to sort of bring us now to India and maybe just a few questions I had, drawing also on, I think, the feedback we got from the audience today on the Indian economy. So, Abhijit, in my job, I was telling you this, I meet state finance secretaries very often. I work at the World Bank, we interact with various government agencies. And when I ask them now what's happening to the economy, by and large, many states will say to me, GST is up, Diwali went very well, there was luxury consumption. So things are looking good. At the same time, within the same governments, when I go talk to, say, social welfare or I talk to the Department of Labor, they will give me data on wages of workers. Exactly what you were saying, actually, what you were describing of the US is, there are so many patterns of that hold right now in the Indian labor market. And there seems to be this, again, this two world, what the IMF has been calling the K-shaped recovery. In that context, one, I wanted you.
They just missed out. I mean, they have to have some more letters. I feel like they should move to the, I don't know, the Cyrillic alphabet or something. There's so many shaped recoveries now.
That's true. But here I'm going to stick to this K-shape for the time. But let me ask you this. One is, how do you square the two? I mean, essentially the economy is deeply wounded. There is long-term scarring. What are you seeing based on your analysis of what's happening to the labor market and contrasting that with this GST transaction obsession? That's one. And the second, I think, question I had related to that was there was also a lot of furor recently and a lot of policy theater, I think that's the best way to describe it, on freebies. On this idea that welfare transfers are, essentially profligate, we need to control them. Sure, there's a need for a sensible fiscal path, but India didn't spend as much as, say, Brazil on social protection coming out of the pandemic. We know this from the data. I'd like you to maybe comment on, and of course, this whole conversation around social protection is linked to what's happening to the labor market and recovery. Maybe I'd like you to come in on this, which is, where is the Indian economy now? Why am I hearing these two very different versions? How do we sort of square that? And what does that mean also for social protection and this fear around freebies?
So, I mean, first order, right now, I mean, we don't really, I mean, the data to really look at this isn't there. For two reasons. One is we don't really have I mean, we never had real-time data. And the second is that we almost never had data on inequality at the top. And this is, so what I would say is entirely, unfortunately, the sort of my hunch based on the two facts you are suggesting. And I think what's happening is an explosion of inequality. I think that there is that squares those two very easily. You sort of see that real wages are falling. Demand for all the smaller cars is flat or hasn't recovered, and this luxury section is doing extremely well. Now, all those things are not That's not definitive, because it would be great to have the data, the real data to look at it. So I can only, but it seems to me that there's
I'm not holding my breath.
yeah, me neither. But nonetheless, I think but I mean, to be entirely accurate, this is a problem we've always had. We never had real time data, so it's not a new problem. But I think plausibly income inequality has been exploding. We certainly see these wild outliers like what's happening to the Adani fortune or something, and then there is partly the inflation is very here right now is driven by factors that are going to hurt the poor. It's energy, and energy is something that you can't really do without. So you don't buy a car, because if you're middle class, lower middle class, you could have bought energy prices are exploding. You're not going to buy your car right now. So it seems to me that there's something quite straightforward about that piece of it, which is that the inflation is the kind of inflation we have, which is a global primary good inflation, is going to hurt the poor. And the fact that Ukraine and Russia were major suppliers to the world wheat and I guess other, I don't know what else, but certainly wheat market. That's another who eats a lot of wheat, not the ultra rich. So I mean, as a fraction of income, they spend very little on wheat. So therefore, this is sort of, it seems fairly mechanical. This kind of inflation that has a large redistributive effect, and that seems to be what's happening. And otherwise, the people who are on the other side of that, who for example are able to raise prices and source from the rest of the world, are making lots of money. It doesn't seem like there's big mystery there. I mean, I could be wrong, because as I said, I can't say I've seen any data saying that, but the guess seems to be that we are in a inequality increasing moment.
Then picking up on that and connecting that to the freebies,
Yeah. So
I mean, because with that explosion of inequality, you would ideally also want to think about what is the response to that. And right now, we're still not, I mean, after the pandemic, there was huge push and conversation around a livelihood stimulus, hasn't really happened. And we're having this conversation on freebies. How do you react to this framing, and what do you think about what needs to be thought through on the social protection? I know you have a recent paper out on social protection as well.
I think let me to be, I think, fair to the government. There's a real concern. The real concern is a kind of a competitive giving around elections, and in some ways you want to discipline that. I think most importantly, because to get money out fast is difficult. So the mechanisms you use are not necessarily great mechanisms, and so there is I think a bias in the system towards and that was true of the before the 2019 elections. Everybody was sort of suggesting that they will provide cash, and so the PM Kisan and all of those are versions of that. Without prejudice against any particular party, I think all parties have got into that, and it's a hard game to get out of, because one side has always the incentive to promise that after the elections we'll do, and now but let me put that on one side. On the other side, what we used to do was even worse. I mean, the traditional way of dealing with these things was loan melas and loan write-offs. Extraordinary inegalitarian way to, because the biggest borrowers are not the poorest typically, and because the poorest can't get loans. So there was a that was an easy way to pump money into the hands of some people, but we use those. So I do think that Mr. Modi is right in saying that this is something on which we should have a conversation. Then there is a question of is it the case that right now we should be increasing redistribution? So there's a question about the how of it, which I think is an important one. I do think there is an important reason to be mindful of the fact that you do these one-off pre-electoral giveaways. That's not the best way to reach the poorest, and certainly not the best way to make sure that the money is spent in ways that are build the even benefit the poor the most. And often they are mistargeted. They're given to people. I mean, and those are all kind of inevitable concomitants of acting very fast and before elections. So I do think that there is an important conversation we should be part of. Now, having said that, we have ballooning inequality. We're not doing very much to deal with it. And I mean, there is an obvious and for me extremely compelling argument for taxing the rich and redistributing that money. Then I think the expectation that this is done by actually increasing taxes, it seems to me to be a good one. That in a sense it gives you and throwing it back to the central government would maybe also be a good one. That they should create funds from which states can decide how to spend it, apportioned by the what do you call it, the fiscal what's the commission that finance commission apportions that, but a sort of fund that they generate, dedicated fund to deal with this growing inequality. And you could actually do it in a relatively scientific way. You could say, look, we see where the top, where, for example, the GST gains are coming from. They're coming from Mercedes-Benzes, okay? So there are easy ways to compute how much of that's coming from luxury goods, and then use that information to say, look, when there is so much of the GST growth is coming from this, we kind of take a reasonable informed guess that this is coming from increased inequality, and use that and dedicate that fund for redistribution. There's all kinds of interesting things we could do if we had the political will to do it. So so that's the long answer to your question.
No, I mean, two things. One, I'd encourage those who are interested to dig deeper into this debate on freebies. One, I'm sure many of you have seen, Abhijit, there's a new paper on social protection. It's a landscaping paper with colleagues from JPAL, I think, and there are several others. It's very useful. And there's also a World Bank paper called Intent to Implementation, which actually talks a bit about what Abhijit was saying about how do you have a sensible fiscal path. Right now, we have 400 different benefit transfer schemes. Countries like Brazil and China have 10 to 12. So I think there is, I take that point, but the conversation around redistribution seems to be really critical, and I wonder who'll anchor it at this stage, but that's, I think, for... Obviously, the other agenda item that one hears a lot during election campaigns, just general discourse in India, is jobs. And everyone says, well, we have a problem of not enough jobs, this beautiful job that will be created. Where are we? How are we going to create these jobs? Is there something that you'd like to see the government doing that they're not? Is there something that governments are doing both at the state level and the central level in India that you're excited by? Could you comment a bit on this creation of jobs landscape?
I'm going to maybe give I'm going to say something that potentially is controversial. Let me just say it. I really think that there are many things that the World Bank talks about. Forgive me. I feel many of them, I don't know that anybody knows how to do them. And I think the government likewise has wants Make in India, and I think to some extent it might be able to move some things, but it's very hard to move. I mean, the experience of the world is that it's very hard to move supply chains. Supply chains are very robust, even though we all love to hate China. China is such an efficient supplier. It's very hard to imagine a major shift in supply chains that's about to happen tomorrow. Okay. Let me highlight something that's much less highlighted. If you look at the data, and whenever we have seen labor force data, one of the striking things is among the people who have less than 10 years of education, and this was true in 89, it was true in 99, it was true in 2009, it's always true. Among people who have less than 10 years of education, the unemployment rate for males was the non-employment rate. Non-employment is those who are out of the labor, includes the people who are both out of the labor force and those who are looking for a job. So people who are in the entire average at age 22, 2% of those people are unemployed. So everybody, every male with less than 10 years of education has a job. That corresponding rate among people who have more than 10 years of education is 60 something percent, meaning 60 some at age 22. And maybe some of them are in college, but you can see that continuing till they're 30. At something like at 32, that number hits the same 2%. And that's very striking. Lots of people are not using 10 years of their life to work. They're doing something else. And they're doing something else, meaning they are typically applying for jobs. They are taking bank exams, they're applying for jobs. Very, very few of those people will get those jobs. And they probably know it, but it's I think the dream of a government job or a bank job is so compelling, and maybe compelling for the families as well, that seems much more better investment of that time than actually taking a job, because jobs are available. That's the point I'm making, is that nothing changes when you get to 32. You find a job, you just take whatever is going. So I think we have created a huge problem by the rents that are in the public sector, in the government jobs. They're really huge rents in those jobs. Our teachers are among the best paid relative to per capita GDP in the world, government teachers. We are among the most generous in the world. So I think we have created a problem. One of the reasons why our labor force is, there's the people who I think who could be working in manufacturing. The people with some degree of skills, I don't want to work in manufacturing. There was an, I mean, there's evidence actually in this similar pattern in many countries. You offer people jobs. An experiment in Ethiopia where there were people were actually given jobs in manufacturing and they immediately quit. This idea of there being the dream job is really a huge problem. Now, how to solve that problem because we're actually going the wrong way on that. We are actually the people who have jobs in the public sector, real jobs, they are getting richer and richer. Then, of course, we can't afford that, so we create bad jobs, which nobody wants, the contract labor jobs. So we're really, even in some sense, we're taking a bunch of our talent, and there's a whole question of women, which we can come to in a minute, which is who, for or for whatever reason, who don't even get to look for jobs. But between that, if you take 10 years of the lives of our better educated people, plus all the women who don't get to work, we're really throwing away something like 60% of our talent. So that's a think about. We always talk about the demand for how to stimulate demand, but if the supply isn't there, the right kind of supply isn't there, people who are high skilled, but who want to do manufacturing jobs, that population doesn't exist here. And you talk to all my friends, they say, I'm introducing robots. I can't get the workers I want. And that's something that I think should worry us at least as much as what we are, the demand for jobs.
And that's actually really interesting because, in a way, then the solution potentially is not, I mean, yes, of course, there's all the sectoral reform and all of that to try and create more jobs. But I think the point that you're making is actually it's a lot of socialization of the labor force itself to think about jobs, aspirations. And this becomes really tricky to do But it essentially starts then with the education system and the way we're socializing aspirations of the young and the youth, right?
Yes, no, exactly. So, I mean, if you talk to parents, and that has then sort of spillovers through the system. You talk to parents and ask them, what do you value in education? And I was just in rural Udaipur district 3 days ago, and I asked someone, and she said, you know, ये nokri. And what's nokri? Nokri means sarkari nokri. And it's really this obsession with sarkari nokri. And so the point of the education system is to get people to a sarkari nokri. Now, 97% of those people will not get a sarkari nokri. I mean, because of course, most of these people, children, don't get the best education in any case. Therefore, but the obsession, and therefore, it's okay for the schools to not serve 90% of the children, because those children are never going to make it to sarkari nokri. So you should focus on the top children, get them to pass the class 12 exam, then maybe go to college, then get a sarkari nokri. So the entire focus of the system is sort of winner take all. And it's not because the teachers are evil that happens. It's because the parents actually want that. Why do the parents want that? It's because we have created this extraordinary vision of the government job being the objective of all education.
Let me now come to the women's question. Where each time, and through the past year, I think you know this, anytime I've actually gone to promote my book, I am always met with so much resentment and resistance towards the data. For some reason, the fact that we're in the bottom 5 of the world when it comes to women's economic freedoms, scratching very low on female employment, it's something the policy community, think tanks, all of us know, and yet there's a sense that there's a reluctance I sometimes sense in absorbing that fact. That's one. And that links then to the way we give priority to this problem. I mean, one argument I would make, and I'm curious to hear what you think, is we need nothing short of affirmative action for women in various private sector jobs. You start to say that, and suddenly again you're in that quagmire of, well, this is not really a problem. Abhijit, I wanted you, I mean, just your reflections on one, have we accepted this as a problem? I mean, I know in the think tanks we have we really accepted it as a problem?
I think so. I think that it's such a huge problem that it's hard to accept it. So but I do
That's very
think
well
do
put.
think
Yeah.
do think that we know that it's a problem in the end, whether we accept it or not. Let me say one thing that I'm not sure affirmative action will necessarily work. I'll tell you a result from a small experiment that one of my students ran. He offered jobs to people, women, at different wages. Before he did that, he found out what the husband's wage was. And as you raise the wage, they're more interested in the job till you hit the husband's wage, in which case they stop wanting the job. So, the part of the problem is that women are not allowed to earn more than their husbands.
Marriage is the problem. Isn't it?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's someone should, yes, exactly.
I,
Can't quantify that, but maybe someday. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I wouldn't use an excuse to not get that as an excuse not to get married. Don't wait for Shahrukh.
This is a longer conversation.
So,
But go on. You were talking about with the experiment. Go on.
Yeah. So, I think one of the I think I said what I had to say, which is that I think it's not clear that affirmative action per se will solve that problem, because I think there is so much till the household understands that it somehow finds a language to navigate that divide. I'm not sure there is a. I think the supply. I don't think there's a lack of demand for women. I think often, in fact, I have a friend who runs a carpet manufacturing firm in UP, and he says the men don't want to do the hard work, and the women aren't allowed to do it. So he's between a rock and a hard place. But he's extremely keen to hire women. That's his. He would like, not for, I mean, maybe also for social reasons, but mostly for just economic reasons. He wants to hire women because men don't have the patience to do those very, very nitpicky jobs that you have to do. So he wants to hire women, but women are not allowed to take those jobs. So he's really up against it. So it's not. I do think that there are jobs, and if you could somehow get the supply side fixed, you could actually there would be jobs for women. So that sense, I'm not sure that the affirmative action per se will help. I mean, it will help, and it worries me that the affirmative action has exactly that feature of targeting the women who are not necessarily the ones who really need the job. So I worry that it's not obvious that that's where I would have landed. I don't know. I do feel that this is where it's more that we need. I think we need a set of institutional changes. I mean, one of the things is just a sense of. I mean, this is not going to solve the problem in my friend's factory in Mirzapur. But urban women, for example, really report insecurity in travel as a reason not to take jobs. So that's something we could solve. We could just make it much safer to travel, and somehow. And of course, it doesn't have to be the real cost of travel. It might be just the imagined pain, and sometimes you feel that. But also there's a real cost. I mean, having the streets of Delhi are really hostile. So I think for women. So I don't see why. I see why they don't want to do it.
So in a way, you're essentially saying that, because in fact it's a debate right now amongst many economists here around the female employment issue, which is it norms or is it the supply of jobs? And in a way, what you're saying is we need to fix the norms. There is a problem at the household level, which will then have impacts on the ability of women to work, obviously. And then there are these ancillary access to credit, transport, make it easier, make the pipeline easier, right?
I think first make it easier. I think there are people at the margin that those are the things you can do relatively, but because that then changes the narrative. It's also being the one woman who's working in a factory with lots of men is very, very hard. It's true for even at the World Bank. So I do think that that's a concern, and it's a concern that so if some women started taking those jobs, there were enough examples to give, you might be able to persuade that it's a safer environment. There are women bosses, and you don't have to. I think that might start to change the norm.
Let me, from there, go to the legacy of Elaben Bhatt. I think many of us are aware and have read her work. I want to read a little bit from an essay she did with Renana Jhabwala about the idea of work. And Abhijit, the reason I want to read this is, one, I'd like you to maybe just reflect a bit about what she's saying and what implications that has about the way economists are thinking about labor nowadays. And she says, a woman who works over 8 hours a day stitching garments or rolling beedies in her home is not counted as a worker. She's viewed as a housewife doing a little something in her leisure time. A street vendor selling vegetables or cutlery is also not a worker. He is a nuisance who is to be removed by the police as soon as possible. A woman who spends her entire day looking after cattle, firewood, caring for the family is also a rural housewife. So is a worker then only a man working in a factory or an office? What is this idea of work that downgrades most forms of work and only recognizes certain limited forms? We've moved a far way in acknowledging work. I mean, now we have welfare funds for informal workers. But do you think in the imagination of the policymaker, when they're thinking of this jobs issue, when they're thinking about social protection, the dominant prototype still tends to be farmer and office factory worker and salaried wage earner? I mean, the people that Elaben was talking about, how far do you think they've traveled in our policy conversation around labor and jobs?
I mean, there are two pieces to that. One is the question of how to treat the household as our welfare system treats the household as a unit, and we haven't really we don't really recognize individuals, and that's a ongoing problem. That's in some ways in the welfare system, given especially the so I grew up next to a large slum in Kolkata, and one of the things that would happen there is that men would change their partners, and when you change the partners, you lose your ration card because the ration card he keeps. And then, so that's an ongoing problem. We really have, we still think of the household as being the primary unit of social redistribution. So that's sort of, there's a labor market piece of it, but it's beyond that. In some ways, it is how we think of the, and there, then the labor market piece is that's partly, I mean, that's a global problem. The fact that we do very poorly accounting for labor force contributions inside the household. Anything that's not visible, whoever takes credit for it gets it. So but that's probably a broader problem with my gender than than that. But I think both are there. I also want to say Ilaben was a very good friend of my mother's, and in a sense, some of these conversations were from in the 1970s. My mother, who's a prominent grumbler, who grumbles all the time about everything in the world, still does. While she was grumbling, I remember I was very young, but I remember I have great memories of her grumbling about labor force participation, accounting, treatment of women in the national income statistics, and all those things. I grew up on this. This was my bread and butter. Mm-hmm.
Let me move to another. Did you want to say something else? Or
No.
Okay. Let me move to another part of your bread and butter, which is I want to talk now a little bit about development economics, and I think particularly behavioral economics and development, all of those tied together. One of the things that I've always found really inspiring in your work across, I think, right from the theory of misgovernance, and I think I've told you this many times, is this sort of introduction of emotions and psychosocial well-being. The idea that workers need psychological assurance to be productive. I want to just quote two lines from Esther Duflo had a Tanner lecture. I highly recommend those who haven't read it, please go read it. She says, optimism and hope can make all the difference. Hope can be as simple as knowing that one will be able to buy the TV one has been looking forward to having. Abhijit, can you reflect on hope within the context of poverty alleviation, what we know about optimism and hope as capability? And I'd like you to, and also maybe just talk a bit about this evolution of thinking much more carefully about human behavior and emotions and loneliness. Your recent paper is on the loneliness of the elderly poor. How are these moving, I mean, these ideas of emotions coming into economic models and moving forward? Just your reflections on that.
Let me slightly dodge that question. There's a reason. The reason is that we actually know some things about that broad frame, less about hope. In some ways, hope is something that it's very hard to randomize. If you like, as you were saying. So, but we do know something that's a couple of things that are relevant to that. One thing we know is that when you look at this work is with very poor people, but one of the things we find, so in economics, the presumption is that everybody is there to be sort of waiting to be lazy. So if you give any chance, and this is sort of you hear that in every discussion of welfare policy, that, aren't we just by helping the poor, helping them to be lazy, and by undermining this whole thing. So we wanted to look at that. And one of the things we did in an experiment was we organized a bag factory in Ghana. We produced 120,000 bags there. And in the bag factory, what we could do is very precisely measure productivity. And we find that if you increase not the wage, but what people we randomize how much people get as a just as a gift, and you increase the gift for over a period of 3 months. We find that you increase the gift, and it's from tiny amounts. You increase it by $2 a week, I think. You increase productivity by 25%. So people are just much more, I mean, rather than becoming lazy when you give them, they actually are enthusiastic. They feel, okay, something's going right in my life. So is that hope? Is that just lack of stress? I don't know. Those are hard things to separate because, hope also makes you forget about all the things that stress you out. So I don't know whether it's hope or just the absence of as much stress, but something you have get this positive effect from giving people a little bit extra money. They get somehow they become more focused, more productive, etc. And there's more evidence on that.
So I have my last question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. Um, I want to read something you recently wrote in the Indian Express, Abhijit, which is I think you were paying tribute to Jagat Mehta, who's a diplomat. You've had a long association with him, and you say, unwavering in his belief that we must try to do the right thing for the right reasons, internally and externally, while accepting that it won't always happen. At a time, we seem to be wavering between trying to be powerful and wanting to be good. I miss Jagat Sahib's voice saying India can only be powerful if we are good. I want to probe a bit on this notion of goodness in sort of three ways. There was a paper that's just come out called Yelling at Yellen, Janet Yellen. Essentially, what these economists did, and it's a fabulous paper for those who are interested in econometric methods, please read it. What they do is they look at the congressional hearings transcripts from 2001 all the way up to 2020. And they try and see when the Federal Reserve Chair comes in to speak to these congressional hearings, how much are they allowed to speak, how are they interrupted? And they essentially find that Janet Yellen is far more interrupted. People are quite nasty to her looking at the data relative to other male Federal Reserve chairs. Again, a problem with perhaps your gender.
Perhaps is in the wrong place.
Wrong place. Yeah,
perhaps in the wrong place in that sentence.
Fair enough. Yeah. Okay. I'll stop. I'll remove the perhaps. Then definitely a problem with your gender.
Yeah, I was more worried about it being perhaps my gender. So,
That's also anyway. Now you're really going to get us into trouble. But here's no. But so there's this. There's a kind of pandemic of pettiness, right, which plays out based on social discrimination, so interrupting people, a kind of aggressiveness. Danny Roderick has this fabulous set of tweets about the jerk quotient in academia. In our politics, in our day-to-day lives, you only need to come from a somewhat marginalized community. I think women in particular are all shaking their heads. I can see them saying, we know what you're talking about. How do you as an economist, if you think about, economists see incentives, costs, prices, what's the way to sort of incentivize certain forms of behavior? How do we disincentivize this kind of pettiness, which seems to play itself out in various positions and fields of power, be it academia, be it our own workplaces? And how do we incentivize this goodness that you were speaking of, I think, in your tribute to Jagat Sahib? Is there a way you can think about that?
I can think about many things, usually inaccurately. So I think that often many of these are responses to insecurity. And I think insecurity is sort of an extraordinary, and it's at all levels. In India as a nation is not as secure in its sense of what it is, and so the US as is a nation is not as secure as it is, and China as a nation is not secure in its vision. And each of them has achieved something. We could take credit for it and say, look, we have done certain things in India. Whatever you say, I mean, we started with some of the most extraordinary forms of discrimination anywhere in the world. The caste system is uniquely, perhaps, as a broad-based system of the 20% discriminating against 80%. This is not slavery. Slavery was 90% discriminating against 10%. We're really talking about a huge majority being discriminated. We really were the world champions. And I think we haven't got all the way or anywhere close to where we need to go, but we've gone a long way. I mean, there are many things that were true even when I was a child, which we take as given that nobody will do that, at least in public. Yeah, I want to get to the point. So I do think we have, but I think we are in a place where we're a little bit always comparing ourselves, and that's true at the individual level. And I think that insecurity is deeply, and when people are insecure, they're petty. And I feel that somehow we need to embrace, I think part of embrace just the fact that, we're still in a, we could, if we only accepted that what China's done is amazing. Let's take credit for it rather than say that, well, that's not enough. We're going to stamp all over the face of the earth. I mean, just that idea that somehow that we could take credit for what we have done. We could say that, we're going to do more, and I think we could relax a bit. I think all of us, I think we're all a little bit too stressed and uptight, and we're too willing to jump on other people to show that we are the top dog.
And on that note, which I hope all of us try and internalize, I'm going to open up the question.
Hello, sir. It's an honor to be here. So my question is, as we were discussing, you were discussing about gender being a problem. My question is there also something? What do you think about caste or other social identities like religion uh, when it comes to economics?
I think they are often imagined problems in the sense that people feel that they need to do something because somehow they have been wronged in one point or the other. I feel like in the end, everybody's wronged somebody, and we could let go a little bit. This I'm not saying there is no. There was no violence in the past. I think there was tons of violence in the past, but there's so many forms of violence that taking revenge for all of them will be all dead by the time we finish. I think we could let go a little bit.
Thank you for that very enlightening conversation. I just wanted to ask, like you were mentioning how these manufacturing jobs are not being taken up by the youth. So I feel a major reason of that is because of the working conditions that is being portrayed as well as the wages. So how do we make these jobs more appealing to the youth?
It's an excellent point. I mean, there is. I mean, it's true, but it's not that in the these are firms in the formal manufacturing sector. So these are not. I mean, there are all kinds of really awful jobs out there. These are not those jobs. We're talking about people who are running factories, large factories in the formal manufacturing sector, paying their taxes, under all the labor codes. So it's a step beyond that. In some sense, I don't disagree that there are many jobs that nobody would want and should want, but these are not those jobs. Even the jobs that are mostly among the better jobs in manufacturing, they have trouble finding people.
I want to ask you about what you feel are your concerns about the Indian central government's attitude towards data and data collection. For example, we saw the government's response to the government's own unemployment data in 2019, where they denied and said that the survey is just bad methodology, etc., etc. And later they said, no, that's actually the real data. And more recently, we saw responses to international data collection and surveys like the World Hunger Index. So, would you say that the central government's attitude towards data, particularly this government's attitude towards data, is a cause for concern?
I think that the World Hunger Index, I really do think was. I think there was a piece of that I found unconvincing. So I think there is I think, and that doesn't help because it makes it legitimizes a certain suspicion of all data. In general, what I think is unfortunate is that the last 30 years we've known that the government's data collection is broken. We've known that for a very long time. I was in a I was in a debate in the early 2000s between Angus Deaton and many others. I was involved. I was in a World Bank conference on that. So there's a book. Yeah. I even have a piece on that in that book. So there was the fact that the data collection is broken. That in particular the rich are entirely excluded. We've known all that. So I can see it's so what that does is it creates an easy way to reject any database. So we knew it's broken. Look at the if you create GDP from the NSS, you get a GDP that's now 50% or less of the GDP you get from the other statistics. So, there is a sense in which I really think that all governments have failed us in creating the right data. And then it's easy if you don't like the data, say it's bad, because it is bad. And then, I mean, it maybe we really need to invest. We were the world inventors of survey methods. Remember, the National Sample Survey is the first nationwide household level consumption survey anywhere in the world. We were the first. We invented this thing. This is us. We should take pride in it. We should create a better one. If this one is broken, that's not enough. We should create a better one. It's really extraordinary that we have for 20 years or 25 years sitting on this fact that we don't understand our own data.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Anna Mitra, a student of 12th grade, and I'm actually pursuing a research, and this is something that I really wanted to ask. In these times when there is discussion between good and poor economics, where does women contribution towards increase in GDP stand? Is it a solution in India in times like these, and can we model China the way they steered through in 1980s?
So I think you asked so many questions, I can't even aspire to answer them. Let me answer a small piece of it, which is, I think China is really interesting. I don't know that anybody, remember, China sort of has all the things that in India economists complain about all the times. The state owns the banks. The banks use credit wherever the state tells them to use it. We do all kinds of things that we tell everybody don't do those. So how they get away with it, we don't fully understand. So it's hard to recommend China as a recipe. And if you want to read more, you can. There's a section on that in our book.
Thanks for the conversations. I have a question for Shrayana, but maybe both of you can address this. Your Instagram page says that you moved to Thailand recently, haven't you? So I spent a couple of years in Thailand after 6 years in Myanmar, and I was very fascinated to notice that they're a monarchy, they are a military-controlled dictatorship, but their economy is, if I may say so, controlled by women. They're the luxury segment, the jobs, the big cars, rented apartments, and you must have noticed this, and you probably comment on it here and there.
On Instagram.
I don't know what's the equation there, but have you noticed if there was a flip or there was an attitude change? Because you've talked about that problem in India, of course, in your conversation, right?
I actually think it's exactly what Abhijit was saying, which is because there are more women right at the start, it's a demonstration effect for lots of other women then to also feel comfortable to be in public space, to go to work together. It's very much about, if you look at the mechanics, in fact, not just of Thailand, but Southeast Asia, East Asia, the idea that you actually had some of these, the first woman who was alone on the factory floor or who owned a restaurant business. It's not just norms, but it's also the fact that people then feel encouraged together to go out and pursue these jobs. And we can chat about it later. I actually do want to give everyone more of a chance to chat with Abhijit, but thank you.
In the book and your talk, you mentioned how schools have failed the 90%, where the children should be given enough chances to succeed and not focus on the 10%. So my question is, in your travels, have you had what have been your observations in context of the internet reaching the poor, and have the poor been adopting the internet and using it to educate themselves? And is there any equation there, or is it a positive one, or is it a bit like again you mentioned in your books how the credit and loans have difficulty reaching the poor? Yeah.
So I think that it's an interesting question, because I think that mostly I was just in, as I say, a place where there was just zero connectivity, and I think that we have a vision of I mean, most places have some connectivity, and we think that that's enough. But I think that sum total of all the barriers, first, the fact that the material isn't written for people, the quality of the screens are not that great, the fact that the connectivity is not that good. In the end, it turns out to be something there to which, people like us have much more access to all those than everyone else. I mean, we could make it better. I mean, it's one of the places where I do feel that if we actually put our heart to it, we could make it better.
Professor Banerjee, this is Shivesh from Shivnadra University. So, based on the conversation you were having on behavioral economics, you were talking about hope increasing the productivity of labor. But there's an element of surprise to it, right? So, if this experiment were extended from 3 months to 30 years, do you think the same level of productivity, increase in productivity, would be seen? Because the surprise element that was there for 3 months is going to diminish as you increase the time of this experiment.
3 months is a long time. In most things, I would say that 3 months. If you look at, I mean, if it's 2 days, I would say I would worry about that more.
Hi, my name's Arvind, and it's a great honor to meet both of you. I just had a question. So on the previous issue, we were talking about how the supply side issue of women's participation in the labor force, and how affirmative action doesn't really just fix that issue. I wanted to ask, is that also limited to to sex-based reform? In the sense that if we look at the example of the U.S., for a while there was also a rejection of the black community towards education, in the sense that if you get that, you're not black enough. So is there an issue in the way that, so that is one question. And just how would we reform affirmative action towards caste-based affirmative
So
action
this is a very long conversation, and we're not going to have it now. I think that overall, the record of affirmative action, on balance, I think is quite positive. I don't think there is any. I think there was all kinds of expressions of whether or not these things will undermine the people we are trying to help, and I don't think there's any strong evidence of that. When these things were being articulated, I think these were plausible enough arguments. I don't think that. I think they're real concerns. I do think that the evidence is relatively positive, actually, and there is now a fair amount of that. So I would say we could do more rather than less, and do it better. I mean, we don't do it particularly well. We have, and partly because we do the reservations at the end rather than the beginning, and we do it because those are easier to control. That creates obvious, means a lot of people never get a chance. But I think we could do better.
I'm really sorry, that's all we have time for in terms of questions. Thank you all for being such a wonderful audience.